This is the intermediate lesson for January 2019 for the free monthly lessons published via Mando.com. Happy New Year, first of all. And to start us off, I'm going to do a little discussion on double stops, or the starting discussion of double stops. I'm going to do a few of these over the year. And this is my definition of a double stop, because this is a question I get asked quite a lot. And it's not as complicated as people often assume they are. So for me, a double stop is where you play two notes at the same time on adjacent strings. One of them, usually the higher note, is your melody note. So let's say, for example, this B is our melody note. And then the other one is another note from the chord that's currently being played. So if your melody note is a B and there's a G chord being played, you can add other notes from the G chord on the adjacent strings to turn that into a double stop. That's my definition. Other mandolin players will have slightly different definitions, and they're not wrong. It's kind of, they are what you make of them yourself. So that is my definition of a double stop. And before you can even start considering putting double stops in my opinion, you need to have a pretty good knowledge of the arpeggio, because if you're playing a G chord, if the band's playing a G chord and you want to play a G double stop, you need to know what notes are going on to know which notes will sound nice. So we're going to start this this lesson with a little arpeggio exercise. And I should say at this point, if you want any of the tab for this or anything music for anything in this lesson, I've linked it below, and there's a little PDF worksheet. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on the key of G. It's kind of a nice starting point for double stops. And so we need to know the G arpeggio. If you've not come across an arpeggio before, it's basically the chord, but with the individual notes played one after the other. So instead of the chord, you take individual notes and play them one after the other. And a chord is made up of three notes, and for a G chord, those three notes are G, B, and D. You need to have those three notes imprinted on your eyelids when you shut them. They should be, you should be able to very quickly say G, B, D. What notes are in the G chord? G, B, and D. The sooner you can get to that stage, the quicker you can start working out where, for yourself, rather than relying on me telling you where the double stops are. So we'll start this by a little G arpeggio exercise. It's just the 2-octave G arpeggio. So I'll count us in after 4, and it'll be about this speed. So then I'll count it in 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do it one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like the notes, the names of the notes, G, B, D, that arpeggio needs to be really quick recall. You need to very quickly go G arpeggio. You need to know where the notes are very quickly, and then the quicker you get to that point, the quicker you can make your own double stops sort of while you're improvising and playing a tune. So if I was to take a particular example, let's say our melody note is the G on the D string, or the 5th fret on the D string. So if that's our current melody note and the band around you is playing a G chord, you've got a few options that you can do to turn that into a double stop. So we've got an adjacent string either side. So we could have the B on the G string. We can have that. We can have the D, that's a closed one there. You could also have the lower open string to create an octave, but that's not as often done on double stops. Normally it's another note in the chord. So we've got a B or a D down there, or you could go above the note. You've got a B and a D there as well. Now I should say at this point, generally you would want your melody note as the higher note in the double stop. It's my preference as well. I just always find that when the double stop note comes in higher than the melody note, your brain tends to hear the higher note that you've just played as the new melody. So it can quite often detracts from what is supposed to be the melody you're playing. So where possible, you want the double stop note that you're adding to be on a lower string than the melody you're currently playing. So in this case, with our melody note on the 5th fret on the D string, I would choose either that B or the D down there. One of those two notes. If the melody note was the G on the E string, up here, the 3rd fret, you've only got one adjacent string. So, and we've got a B here, and we've got a D there, so we can either have that as a double stop, or we can have that as a double stop. So we can either go 3 and 2, or 3 and 5. Both would be perfectly fine double stops if the band was playing a G chord. You don't always have to use a note that's in the chord. It can sometimes sound nice, but a general rule, especially for this starting point, sort of stick to the notes that are in the chord that's currently being played. That's the basic principle behind double stops. Know your arpeggio, fit it in with the chord that's being played around you, and where possible try and keep the melody note as the higher of the two. And then it's kind of up to you, really. Take that with you. Get to know your arpeggios. Just try it out. Just try what you do and don't like. There's no big secret to it other than learning your arpeggios and listening to what's around you. There is one way that some players do where they don't learn the arpeggio and they just learn kind of set patterns of double stops that they know work and sort of not worry about the notes. That's perfectly fine. That's not the way I learn, and so that's not the way I'm going to teach it. But that's a perfectly valid way. If you want to just kind of learn the actual shapes and not worry too much about the notes, that'll be absolutely fine. But what I'm going to do for the rest of this lesson is we're going to put it into practice, and I'm going to use the not the basic bluegrass tune, but a standard bluegrass tune called Cripple Creek. I'm going to double stop it to the nth degree. So I'm going to go a bit ridiculous with the double stops just to show you how far you can take it. I would never put this many in if we're playing the tune, but it's a useful tune to show where and how many you can actually put in. So let's take, if you don't know the tune, just Google it, it's a bit available everywhere. But the opening bar, the opening 2 bars sounds like this. So our melody, rather handily, is all up here. So if we just take note 1, that's that G, and we discussed it earlier. So we could either go. That I don't really like that one. I think I prefer the sound of this one to start with. So I'm going to add some extra notes in rather than go. I'm just going to add. And then on that last note of the first bar, on the B there, I'm going to add the G, but not G below, because this is all over a G chord. So for the first one, I'm adding a D note, and then for the last note, I'm going to add a G note, all part of the G chord. So instead of going, it now sounds like this. A bit more interesting. And then in the second bar, the chord changes to C. So we now have to change what notes we're adding as a double stop. And our first note is a C. And then on the string next to it, we can add, we've got a choice of 2 notes. We can either in a C chord, you've got C, E, and G. The melody note is C, so we need to add an E or a G somewhere. So we've got an E there or a G there. So we can either add the E or we can add the G. They both sound pretty nice. That was with the G, or that was with the E. I quite like the sound of the E, so I'm going to add the E in. And then at the end of that bar, the last note, it goes back to the G chord, and we have a D note as the melody. So there's a little problem here, is that the only option you would have if you were to stay down here is to add the G in, and it doesn't sound that great, and it's kind of an awkward one to get to. So this is where you have to change position slightly, and realise that on this D string, past the 7th fret, there's a B note here on the 9th fret, which again, part of the G chord, G, B, D. So under this D note here, if we played that D note with our first finger, it opens up the opportunity of this B note here. So instead of just, we've got now this. So that second bar now sounds like this. Instead of, I've added some double stops in. So the first two bars now sound like this. Just with this I've added double stops. I'll do that again. So that's the basic principle of double stops. Know your arpeggios, add notes that are in the chord that's currently being played, so you have to be aware of when the chord changes, and just run with it, just try it. If you know, the point of this is if it doesn't work, then you remember what doesn't work, just go for it. So we're going to have a play of Cripple Creek now. If you want the tab of music for this, click the link at the bottom of this video. All the tabs free on the music. There's a little PDF worksheet that will guide you through everything I've just said. And I'm going to have the metronome in, so you don't have to worry about the timing. And we're going to do it twice through with the repeats, so 2 A's, 2 B's, 2 A's, 2 B's. Do as much or as little of the double stops as you want. Some of them are quite hard, especially on your little finger, but they're all based on the theories that I've discussed in the last few minutes. So best of luck. We're going to do it about this speed. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Repeat. B part. Repeat the B part. To the top. Repeat the A part. B part. Repeat the B part. That's it for this month. I realised that I have specifically written that quite hard, so if you're struggling with some of them, just don't play them to start with, and you'll eventually get round to get that little finger strength up, especially that last bar. Yeah, quite tricky. But keep going, keep persevering, and if you have any questions, head over to mandolin.com and I'll answer them as best as I can. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next month.